Scottish salmon. It's advertised as delicious, healthy and sustainable. Is it possible to be sustainable at this scale? And how is it so affordable? A little bit of Googling turns up all these articles about the benefits of the salmon industry for Scotland. But there are also quite a few about the environmental impacts. The more you look, the more confusing things get. So me and the crew have decided to make our way up to Scotland to try and find out for ourselves. We've set up a few interviews that will hopefully help us to find out the true price of salmon. Most Scottish salmon is farmed, making a salmon farm the most obvious first stop on our journey. Mowi, a Norwegian fisheries company, is one of the biggest producers of salmon in the UK. We're paying a visit to Westeros Fisheries, one of their farms that prides themselves in their sustainable practices. We're being shown around by Managing Director Gilpin Bradley.
So our approach with salmon farming is for our customers to have 100% confidence in every aspect of how we grow our salmon. What our salmon eat is critical, so we only use fish meal which is produced from trimmings of fish that have been caught for human consumption. As a result of farming a cold-blooded mammal, we achieve a very efficient food conversion ratio, i.e. about 1 kilo of feed to about 1.2 kilos of salmon. What do you think chicken's food conversion ratio is? It's about 2.5. Pork, I think it's about 5 or 6. Cattle, it's about 20. Highly inefficient. Biggest source of protein in the world today is chicken and pork, okay? In future, it's going to be fish because it's more efficient to grow.
So this net is obviously out of the water. Everything's attached by ropes. As an industry standard, most salmon farms have net scrubbers. That produces clouds of debris in the water. So we prefer to keep these fish breathing clean water. We lift the net, give it 2 weeks in the sun, wind and rain to clean, take the algae off it, and then we'll drop it again, and that pen of fish will be swum through into here using a net tunnel. If you want to come here just and look at this one, you can see a sea louse actually on the tail of this fish. We want to keep these to a minimum, and that's the other thing that Adam's recording. He will be counting sea lice.
So we have, for example, 25 fish from a pen group this size and monitor the lice numbers, and that goes into the public domain. The issue is having too many lice, but it has to be an enormous number to cause any harm to the fish. Ideally, we want as low as possible, but that's where, the wrasse and lump fish come in and do a super job.
We call these cleaner fish, and they actually take the sea lice off the salmon. So it's a perfect biological control. We've got a mixture of wild-caught ballan wrasse. We feed them a special diet to supplement the sea lice diet, and this is very important to us. We place as much importance on getting our cleaner fish husbandry right as we do farming the salmon.
We're employing youngsters today who could have been fishermen, okay? Ullapool, at one point, was the largest fishing port in the UK by volume of catch. Seawater temperatures have changed. The fish have moved. What are those fishermen doing now? A lot of those fishermen and sons of fishermen are working for us. Sustainable practices are the backbone of profitability for our business. So we're adjusting our business model to suit the reality of the changing environment. Being economically sustainable is equally as important as being environmentally sustainable. The two go hand in hand.
It was great to see a salmon farm for ourselves. Westeros were very open to all of our questions, and they were even kind enough to give us some of their salmon. However, Westeros are one of the most sustainable farms in Scotland, and there are still concerns for the industry as a whole. Some of the most outspoken voices are those who are actively speaking out against salmon farming. So we're going to speak to conservationist and diver David Ainsley, who's been raising awareness around some of the issues.
We've seen the expansion of salmon farming from relatively small, locally owned cages to huge biomass cages with biomasses in excess of 3,000 tons, owned by multinational companies generally. And we've seen the environmental problems that this has caused. We are farming huge quantities of fish very close to each other. So we're creating ideal conditions for sea lice, and the salmon are eaten alive by these parasites. So you would think that using wild wrasse to clean fish would be good, would be very sustainable. But it's not. They only live in small areas. They don't move far. They're a classic fish stock for a boom and bust industry. In other words, you move into an area, you fish them out, and they never come back. Salmon farms produce a number of different types of pollution. The most obvious is the feces, is the fish poo, which settles on the seabed around and underneath the farm. And the mud below that, if it's a mud seabed, is anoxic. So there's no oxygen in, so when you put your hand in, you get this sort of black and stinky layer. So you have a dead zone around the salmon farm.
But where are the dead zones?
Allegedly, purportedly, underneath farms on the seabed.
And if you'd asked me this question at sea, what I'd have done is I'd have put in a fishing line and caught some fish, or caught something on the seabed, which would demonstrate that it's far from a dead zone. In fact, it's actually exactly the opposite. I'm very surprised you've asked that question, to be honest. Haven't been asked that before, so well done. New question. The reality is that our salmon farms are nurseries, and they're nurseries for young fish in the sea lochs, for shellfish, and because it's a protected area, there's no real predators around, there's a supply of nutrients which they feed on.
Clearly, there's some debate over what's actually happening beneath the salmon farm. We've reached out to benthic ecologist Tom Wilding, who studies the seabed for the Scottish Association for Marine Science.
The concept of the dead zone is not one that I really understand, to be honest. Well, the benthic environment around fish cages is modified by the presence of the fish cage. So that fecal material which comes down from the fish changes the benthic environment. So they are anoxic, but there are lots of organisms that are able to survive in anoxic conditions and actually thrive in anoxic conditions, and they've evolved to thrive in those conditions. And so around fish cages, you get very high abundances of these hydrogen sulfide tolerant worms, polychaete worms generally. And if there have been concerns, for example, around fish cages and the impacts on the environment, our main purpose is to provide the evidence base that policymakers and their advisors can use to develop policy.
Tom gave us an idea of how his research impacts policymaking, but ministers also have a role to play.
So we're here outside the Scottish Parliament building to see what Ariane Burgess, Green MSP, has to say.
The salmon sector, or the salmon industry, says that it's a sustainable industry. And I think right from the get-go, I think that is very questionable. What are we talking about here? Are we talking about economically sustainable? Yes, okay, it's very economically sustainable. But when we talk about the environmental sustainability of salmon farming, I don't believe it is the case that it is sustainable, and I don't believe it's the case that will ever be sustainable. We need industry or jobs that are actually working with nature. And right now, the salmon farming sector works against nature and leaves a lot of problems for coastal communities. I mean, it is regulated. They have to get licenses from Marine Scotland and also from SEPA. But there's effort being done to regulate, but I think that we need to be reviewing it again. In the light of climate change, in the light of the biodiversity emergency, we need to actually really take this seriously and see, are we doing enough?
Right. So regulation is tougher for a farmer of the sea than any other farmer in the United Kingdom. In fact, globally, aquaculture is subject to stricter regulation for the simple reason that it's new and people don't understand the impact. And to be honest, as a farmer, we welcome strict regulation.
If the regulators did what they're meant to do, in most cases, we wouldn't have so many environmental problems. Some of these regulations kind of fall between two departments, with everybody saying it's not our responsibility.
SEPA and Marine Scotland are the departments responsible for the regulation and licensing of salmon farms. SEPA unfortunately declined to interview, and after 4 months of talking to Marine Scotland, they too have declined to interview. In the absence of these interviews, we asked Ariane what was currently happening with the regulation of the industry.
Why we're where we're at right now is because in Session 5, which is the previous session of the Parliament, 2 committees in the Scottish Parliament took evidence on the problems around the salmon farming industry, and they came up with over 60 recommendations on changes that need to happen. And right now, we've not really tackled many of those environmental issues. We've got the Griggs review that talked about kind of streamlining the industry and actually making it maybe easier to bring on salmon farms, but we haven't really addressed the environmental impacts.
Well, I mean, what's interesting about Professor Griggs' review was encouraged by the industry. So I'm not sure of the final outcome of how that's going to look, but the early outcome, the early signs are it will be a stricter level of regulation, even greater transparency. It will make it probably even easier to sell our salmon.
Marine Scotland appointed a Professor Griggs, and Professor Griggs is not a biologist. His job is to aid the expansion of the industry with apparently scant regard to the environmental consequences. We need real, genuine scientific evidence to work on. And where there is a lack of scientific evidence, we must bring in the precautionary principle. So if you don't know if doing something is going to be damaging, you have to assume that it will until it's proven that it won't. I mean, relaxed regulation has definitely happened and continues to happen. Lobbying from the industry must be effective, but lobbying from conservationists in itself appears not to be very effective.
There's lots of different ideas on the effectiveness of current regulation. To find out how people are able to make their case when it comes to the policies that affect those regulations, we spoke to lobbying expert Tommy Kane.
Lobbying at its most basic is a conversation like you and I are having now, where a lobbyist will go to a minister, a special advisor, an MSP, either with the governing party or the opposition, and make a pitch and make their case about issues that they're most concerned with. Now that can be in a meeting room like this, it can be in a government building, it can be over Zoom, or it could be over a dinner table. We all want to change, we all want to get legislation that we believe in, but what we've got to be careful of is those with the most money influence things to suit their own vested interest more than the interests of wider society and, if you like, the 99%. Well, let's take salmon. We know in 2018 that the Rural Affairs Committee published a report that said we should be looking at the environmental impact of salmon farming, and it also said that the precautionary principle should be applied. Fast forward to February 2022, a review conducted by Russell Griggs, who's the insider's insider of the Scottish Government, he basically said in that report we need to relax the precautionary principle. So let's ask ourselves the question, what happened between 2018 and 2022? Within that 4 years, there's been an intense lobbying effort made by the industry to talk more about the economic benefits than what the environmental concerns are. I think that would suggest that over the past 4 years, that lobbying effort has been fairly successful.
Our trip has shown us that the industry is a complex and contentious issue. Some suggest that it is polluting and in need of reform, while others suggest that it is the heavily regulated, sustainable future of protein production. We asked our contributors one final question while we were in Scotland. What do they think the price of salmon might be?
I think it should be contextualised compared with the price of beef or the price of mutton or chicken or pigs or whatever. The landscapes that we know and love are, massively modified by human activity. There's virtually nothing remaining, and yet, we still love those landscapes. So I do feel that any report on salmon should be contextualised properly.
I think slightly misleading title, to be honest with you. The price, the long-term price of salmon needs to be sustainable for the environment, i.e. zero adverse long-term impact on the environment. It must be commercially sustainable for the farmer and acceptable to the consumer. And you juggle all those three balls to come up with what the price should be. I would encourage you to think along the lines of farming the sea is an investment in the future. It's an investment in producing healthy protein for the next generation.
You know, a degree of pollution which was localized, which was only organic pollution and localized around the farms, is perhaps acceptable. We can say, okay, you know, we're prepared to accept that 10% of the sea lochs might be polluted. But it's gone beyond that. It's gone way beyond that. So we're not at a cliff edge. We passed that a long time ago. We are now doing irreparable damage to our seas, and salmon farming is one of the major culprits.
I think the wider cost of enjoying salmon is everything that we've been talking about so far. I mean, the wider cost is the damage to the environment and also animal welfare. So we need to go back to high quality with high environmental and animal welfare and really go for that. I don't think we can compete on price, but I think we could actually do something really right for the environment, for those animals that are being farmed and the way that they're treated, and go for something that people start to say, I'm going to have salmon, but I'm going to have it once in a while.